In a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a Chicago skyscraper, 6 international executives sat around a table that cost more than most people earned in a year. At the head of the room stood Evelyn Whitmore, 29 years old, Harvard-educated, and running one of the fastest-growing logistics technology firms in North America. When a man in a faded blue shirt carried in a tray of coffee cups, she barely glanced at him before turning to her foreign guests and laughing softly. "Does he even understand us?" The whole room laughed with her. No one in that moment knew they were mocking the only person in the room who could speak every single language they were using to do it. If you have ever been dismissed for how you look before anyone asked who you are, this story will remind you exactly how much the quiet ones are worth. Caleb Harper arrived at the office every morning before 6, not because anyone had praised him for it or noted it in a review, but because arriving early meant he could park his 12-year-old Civic in the covered lot before the spaces filled, which saved him from walking 4 blocks in Chicago winter with a laptop bag held together by electrical tape. He was 32 years old, a logistics support technician and low-level operations assistant at GlobalAxis Solutions, a multinational logistics technology company headquartered in the Loop District. And on paper, his job was to manage filing, systems, coordinate freight tracking reports, and ensure meeting rooms were set up correctly for executive sessions. In practice, it meant he was the person nobody noticed until something went wrong. And the person nobody noticed even then, because when things went wrong, attention moved upward in an organization, and Caleb's desk was very much at the bottom. His colleagues on the operations floor had formed their opinions of him within weeks of his arrival and seen no reason since. To revise them, he wore the same rotation of 5 button-downs, all slightly faded from washing, drove a car with rust above the rear wheel well, and almost always volunteered for overnight freight tracking shifts because those paid a modest differential that helped with Grace's babysitter. His daughter's name was Grace, and she had just turned 6. Every day at noon, if the break room was quiet enough, Caleb would sit by the window with his phone propped against a coffee mug and video call her while she ate lunch at her after-school program. Grace had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of tilting her head to one side when she was thinking hard about something, and she would hold up whatever she had drawn that morning, a purple horse, a yellow star, sometimes a streak of mixed color she called simply feelings, and Caleb would study it with the careful seriousness of someone being shown a masterwork. These noon calls were the only part of his workday during which his face fully relaxed, the only part where the particular quality of attention he maintained, everywhere else watchful, measured, self-contained, gave way to something open and unheld. His coworkers occasionally glimpsed these calls in passing and assumed, without curiosity, that he was using some kind of children's translation app on his phone. Because during the calls, he and Grace often practiced words in multiple languages, and it did not occur to any of them that a person in Caleb's position might have a reason to know those words without an app. On the corner of his desk, stacked without ceremony, next to a broken stapler and a cup of pens, were a Japanese grammar workbook bristling with sticky notes, a German-English dictionary with a cracked spine warped from use, and a small ring of handwritten flashcards in Arabic script, the ink worn at the edges from being handled daily. If you passed his workstation without stopping, you would see a man quietly doing paperwork and think nothing of it. No one stopped. Evelyn Whitmore had walked past his desk approximately 40 times in the 3 months since Caleb had transferred to the Chicago headquarters, and had never looked long enough to register his face. She was not cruel by deliberate intention, she was simply operating inside a mental map of the world in which people like Caleb did not register as significant. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard at 22, completed her MBA at Wharton at 25, and become CEO of GlobalAxis at 28, after the company's founder stepped back due to health. She was brilliant, relentless, and accustomed to rooms where everyone wore tailored clothes and spoke the same language of ambition and credential. In the architecture of her professional world, Caleb Harper was simply part of the background, present, functional, and entirely invisible. The apartment where Caleb and Grace lived was a two-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side. And it was not a sad apartment. It was a real one, the kind where the furniture had been chosen for function, where the refrigerator held actual food rather than decorative bottles of mineral water, and where every corner reflected the life being genuinely lived inside it. There were drawings taped to the wall near the kitchen table, each one labeled in Grace's handwriting in 2 or 3 languages. A horse in Japanese, the sun in Arabic, a flower in German. Caleb had been teaching her since she was 3, not as a curriculum but as a game, the way some fathers teach baseball statistics or name every dinosaur. He taught his daughter the words for colors and animals and feelings in the languages that had shaped his life, and she absorbed them with the cheerful greediness of a child who has not yet learned that some knowledge is supposed to be difficult. On weekday evenings, after Grace was bathed and her backpack was packed for the next day, Caleb would sit at the kitchen table and open his old laptop for freelance software repair work. Small businesses, mostly, who needed bugs fixed for $18 an hour, and whose problems required the kind of focused attention that meant he did this work only after Grace was asleep. Some nights he stayed up past 1 in the morning, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the far-off sound of traffic. He never complained about this to anyone, not because he was performing stoicism, but because it simply did not occur to him that his life required an audience for its difficulties. One evening, Grace padded out of her room in her socks and found him at the table, and she climbed into his lap without asking and said, in the careful way of children who have been thinking for a long time, "Daddy, how come you don't tell the people at work that you know so much?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because people who are truly strong don't need to prove it every day." Grace considered this with her head tilted. "Okay," she said, and went back to bed. The story of how Caleb Harper ended up at a corner desk in a mid-level operations role was not a story of failure. His parents had been international engineering consultants for a development organization, and by the time Caleb was 20, he had lived in Germany, the United Arab Emirates, Japan, Brazil, France, and Mexico. He had not learned the languages of those places from textbooks or software programs. He had learned them in classrooms and street markets, and the apartments of neighbors, and the specific, irreplaceable way that comes from living inside a language, rather than studying it from hearing the same phrase used 100 different ways in 100 different contexts, until the meaning stopped being a translation in his head and became simply a thought. By the time he finished his graduate degree in international business, he spoke 6 languages with the kind of fluency that includes idiom and cultural register, and the knowledge of what certain phrases mean when spoken in certain rooms. He spent 7 years after that as an international contract negotiation specialist for one of the largest maritime shipping conglomerates in the world, working across 4 continents, saving contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars by understanding not just the words being spoken, but the cultural logic behind them. Then his wife, Renata, had gotten sick. Then Renata had died, and then there was only Grace, 6 weeks old. And Caleb sitting in a hospital room holding a child who would never know her mother, understanding in that moment that every other priority in his life had just been permanently rearranged. He kept his old passports in a shoebox at the top of the bedroom closet, 4 of them, 2 American, 1 German residency document, 1 UAE work permit, all stamped full with a decade of crossings. He never looked at them. Grace had found them once and spent an entire afternoon making him describe every country on every stamp. He had done it in 6 languages. The GlobalAxis International Summit had been 18 months in the planning, and the contract on the table was an $80 million agreement to deploy the company's new AI-powered logistics routing system across the supply chains of 6 major international corporate groups simultaneously: a Japanese automotive manufacturer, a German industrial firm, a UAE-based freight conglomerate, a French retail distributor, a Brazilian agricultural export company, and a Mexican infrastructure development group. For Evelyn, this deal was not simply a business transaction. It was the proof she intended to offer to a board that had questioned, privately and occasionally not so privately, whether a 29-year-old with no operations background could run a company of this complexity. She had spent 6 months preparing the technical presentations, the financial projections, the cultural briefing documents, and had hired a specialist translation firm to handle all written materials. She believed she had prepared for everything. On the morning of the summit, Caleb's assignment was simple. Prepare the executive conference room on the 42nd floor. Ensure the beverage service was in place. Deliver the printed document packets to each delegate's seat, and remain available outside in case additional copies were needed. He arrived at 6:15. By 9, when the international delegates began arriving, the room was ready, water glasses filled, folders at each seat, name placards positioned correctly, the AI demo terminal running its startup sequence at the presentation end of the table. Caleb gathered the empty supply boxes and began to exit. Then realized he had left a binder on the credenza and turned back. That small delay, no more than 90 seconds, was the moment everything changed. As the delegates settled into their seats and the pre-meeting conversation began, they shifted naturally into their own languages. The German representative commented quietly to his colleague that the technical documentation seemed to have been formatted without awareness of their reporting standards. The Japanese delegates exchanged a brief observation in Japanese. They noted that the AI demo's data refresh cycle was inconsistent, which in their operational framework signaled a reliability concern. The UAE group's lead negotiator said something in Arabic to his associate that translated roughly to, "This company may be concealing something about their error rate." Caleb, standing at the credenza with his back to the room, heard every word. He understood every word. Evelyn entered at exactly 9:15, flanked by the chief revenue officer and the head of technical operations, and greeted the delegates with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in rooms like this. Then she saw Caleb still at the credenza, straightening the water pitcher with the careful attention of someone trying not to make a sound. She stopped. She looked at him. She looked at her international guests. Something in her, perhaps the accumulated performance anxiety of 18 months of preparation, perhaps the impulse that power sometimes has to define itself by contrast, made her laugh softly. "Does he even understand us?" she said, in the light tone of a throwaway joke. 2 of the executives near her chuckled. From across the table, the chief revenue officer added, with the careless ease of someone who thought he was being charming, "I doubt he even finished college." Another round of quiet laughter followed. Caleb did not turn around. He picked up the binder. He walked to the door. Before he closed it behind him, he paused for exactly 1 second. And then he left. Nobody noticed his expression. If they had, they might have seen something that was not embarrassment and was not anger, but the look of a person who has just been given a very specific kind of clarity. The kind that comes from realizing, without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what a room full of people thinks of you. In the hour between the morning setup and the afternoon signing session, Caleb sat at his desk and opened a set of files he had been trying, through proper channels, to have someone act on for 11 days. The technical implementation files for the GlobalAxis AI logistics system accessible to him, because his operations support role involved processing the shipping data those files were built to manage, contained a critical, structural error he had first noticed during a routine audit batch. The system's AI translation engine, the core component responsible for converting logistics commands and freight status data between the 6 languages of the new contract's partners, was conflating certain technical terms across Japanese and German that shared superficial phonetic similarities in its training data, but had entirely different operational meanings. In a live deployment, this would cause the AI to misclassify cargo movement statuses across international hubs, containers flagged as delivered when still in transit, freight delays logged as weather observations, insurance triggers misfiled. Over 6 months, The cascading errors across 6 partner supply chains would create a logistical failure of international proportions. He had brought this to his direct supervisor 11 days earlier. His supervisor, a man named Dave, who managed the operations floor with the primary goal of preventing anything from reaching his desk that might complicate his quarterly review, had looked at the report for approximately 4 seconds and said, "Your job is to carry files, not audit. The engineering team submit a feedback form if you have concerns." Caleb had submitted the form. He had followed up twice by email. He had received no response. He later learned the standard feedback form was reviewed quarterly, with the next review scheduled for 3 weeks after the contract signing date. And so, on the morning of the summit, after being laughed out of the conference room, Caleb sat at his corner desk and looked at the screen and thought carefully about what he was going to do. He thought about the German delegates' quiet concern about reporting standards, which he had heard that morning, and which confirmed that the partners were already sensing something was wrong, they simply did not know what. He thought about the thousands of international freight shipments that would flow through a broken system. He thought about the moment, months from now, when the failure became undeniable, and whether being right all along would feel like anything other than a waste. He opened the Japanese delegate's briefing packet, found a phrase on page 17 that the translation firm had rendered with technical accuracy but cultural incorrectness, a liability clause that in the register it had been translated into carried an implication of blame placement. No Japanese business partner would accept at the opening stage of a collaboration, and quietly made the correction, reprinted the page, and went back upstairs to exchange it in the Japanese delegate's binder. Nobody saw him do it. Later that afternoon, during a break, the lead Japanese delegate leaned over to his colleague and remarked on the unusual precision of that particular clause. It felt, he said, as though someone who actually understood them had been paying close attention. The formal signing session began at 2 o'clock, and for the first 15 minutes everything proceeded exactly as rehearsed. The AI logistics system ran a live demonstration real-time simulation of cross-border freight routing, showing how the system would automatically process shipping instructions and compliance documents across all 6 partner regions simultaneously. The visuals were clean. The routing algorithms performed correctly in the test environment. Evelyn watched the delegates' faces and read cautious interest in most of them, which was as much as she had hoped for at this stage. Then the demo reached the multilingual data integration segment, the portion showing how the system would handle communications between regional logistics hubs operating in different languages. A freight status update originated from the German hub. The AI processed it, translated it, and distributed it to all partner displays simultaneously. On the screen at the front of the room, in large block letters visible to everyone, the translated output read, "Cargo delay risk international deviation flagged." The German representative straightened in his chair, looked at the screen, and said in German, quickly and not quietly enough, "That is not what the original message said. That message said, weather observation delay." The technical operations director, seated along the side wall, leaned toward his laptop and began typing rapidly. The display refreshed. The same error appeared again. He typed faster. The Japanese delegates had been watching carefully, and one of them spoke in Japanese to the delegate beside him, a sentence that expressed something close to, "This is exactly the reliability inconsistency we noted this morning, which confirms our concern." The UAE negotiator shifted his posture and said something in Arabic to his associate. The French delegate frowned at his translated copy of the routing report and turned a page back as if checking whether he had misread something. The Brazilian and Mexican delegates exchanged a glance that required no translation. The room, which had been warm with professional attention, had gone cold. Evelyn's chief revenue officer moved to the front and spoke urgently in English, explaining that this was a variance in the demo environment, not present in live deployment. Easily corrected. Nobody appeared to believe him. The German representative said, in English this time, And with the particular precision of someone choosing words carefully, we have concerns about systemic translation accuracy that go beyond this demonstration. The Japanese lead delegate nodded. Evelyn stood very still. Her technical team was crowded around the demo terminal, and their expressions communicated everything she needed to know. They did not understand the specific nature of the error, which meant they could not fix it in the time remaining. She understood, standing at the front of that room in front of a deal she had spent 18 months building, that she was about to lose it, and that she did not know why. From the back of the room, near the door, where he had been standing quietly because the document delivery process had run long and no one had formally told him to leave, Caleb Harper watched the room disintegrate. He had seen this before. Not the specific error, but the specific failure. The moment when a negotiation stops being about business and starts being about trust. And trust is rebuilt only by the person in the room who understands what everyone is actually saying. He set down the folder he was holding. He walked toward the presentation terminal at the front of the room. A senior director standing to the left of the terminal looked at him and said, with the full weight of institutional hierarchy, "Get out." Caleb stopped walking. He was standing at the center of the room now, between the presentation terminal and the conference table. And he looked at the senior director, and he looked at Evelyn, and he looked at the screen behind him where the erroneous translation was still displayed. Then he turned to the German delegates and spoke in German. Not the careful, slightly formal German of a textbook learner or a translation tool, but the German of someone who had lived in Frankfurt for 3 years in his mid-20s, who had filed tax documents and argued with landlords and attended football matches in that language. He said, calmly and precisely, that he understood the concern about the translation variance, that the error originated not in the routing logic, but in the training dataset's conflation of a specific class of meteorological logistics codes with delay classifications, and that this was a correctable architectural issue that did not affect the underlying freight management system. The room went completely silent. Not the silence of a conversational lull, but the silence of an entire room recalibrating. The German representative stared at him. His colleague set down his pen. Evelyn, standing 10 feet away, felt something she had not felt in a professional setting since her first year out of college, when she had presented a flawed financial model to a room full of senior analysts and someone had quietly but unmistakably seen through it. She felt exposed. Caleb turned to the Japanese delegates and continued in Japanese formal business. Japanese, the specific register used in high-stakes negotiations, with the precise grammatical structures that signal both technical competence and respectful deference. He described the system error in terms that mapped directly to their operational framework, acknowledged the concern they had raised among themselves during the break, and explained the specific corrective measure that would address the data stability issue they had observed in the demo's refresh cycle. Then he addressed the UAE team in Arabic, the Gulf dialect of Dubai's business districts, carrying the particular cadences of a city where international commerce is conducted with intense awareness of relationship and trust. He told them, in Arabic, that the company had a real problem and that he was here to tell them the truth about it. Then he moved to French, then to Portuguese, for the Brazilian team, specifically the São Paulo business dialect, precise and warm, then Spanish for the Mexican delegates, with the formality of the capital's business register. Each time, he addressed not just the technical content of the crisis, but the specific cultural register of each group, what each delegation needed to hear, in the manner they needed to hear it, to begin moving from distrust back toward engagement. By the time he finished, he had spoken for approximately 8 minutes, moving between languages the way a musician moves between keys, not as separate acts of translation, but as a single fluid expression of a mind that had lived inside all of them. The French delegate had put down the report he had been reviewing and was looking at Caleb directly. The German representative, who had been on the verge of formally withdrawing 15 minutes earlier, had his hands folded on the table in the posture of someone who has decided to keep listening. The Japanese lead delegate looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he inclined his head slowly, in the particular gesture of respect that in Japanese professional culture carries more weight than most verbal expressions. Evelyn watched this. She had never seen a room full of international business executives respond to any of her employees this way. She had never seen a room full of international business executives respond to her this way. The next 45 minutes were unlike anything GlobalAxis's conference room had witnessed. Caleb worked through the problem, systematically explaining the core architectural error in terms the technical team could act on immediately, addressing each partner group's specific concerns in their own language, walking the German and Japanese delegates jointly through the data integration framework to demonstrate that the error was isolated and not indicative of deeper system instability. At one point, he turned to the whiteboard and wrote out the specific data field classification causing the conflict, annotating it in 3 languages simultaneously: German, Japanese, and English, so that both the technical team and the international partners could follow the same explanation without requiring interpretation. It was an ordinary act of practical intelligence, the kind of thing someone does when they are focused entirely on solving a problem rather than managing anyone's perception of them. During a brief break in the working session, the German representative approached Caleb directly and asked, in German, whether he had worked internationally before. Caleb said yes. The German representative asked where. Caleb said Hamburg, among other places. Which firm? He asked. Caleb named the maritime conglomerate. The German representative's expression changed in the way of someone who knows enough about an organization to understand what that answer means. Not surprise, exactly, but a fundamental reassessment happening in real time. It was in this moment that the full history came forward, not as a dramatic announcement, but as the natural consequence of a professional conversation between 2 people who both understood the world being referenced. Caleb had spent 7 years as an international contract negotiation specialist for one of the largest maritime shipping conglomerates in the world, working across 4 continents, negotiating in 6 languages, preventing 3 major international logistics crises that would have affected supply chains, serving tens of millions of people. He had received 2 industry awards for cross-cultural negotiation practice, both listed on his professional record under a version of his name that no one at GlobalAxis had ever looked up. He had left that world not because he failed, not because he was pushed out, not because the work had defeated him, but because his wife had died, and his daughter needed a father who came home before 8 o'clock and was present enough to read her stories in multiple languages before bed. He had chosen the corner desk. He had chosen the old Civic and the overnight shifts and the invisible life of a man with no visible ambition, not because he had given up, but because he had decided, with full and clear-eyed deliberateness, what mattered most to him. The Japanese lead delegate spoke to Evelyn directly toward the end of the session and said, very carefully, in English, "You have someone remarkable working for you. I hope you know that." Evelyn said nothing. She was standing near the window, and the afternoon light coming through made it impossible for anyone across the room to read her expression clearly, which was perhaps fortunate, because her expression was not one she would have chosen to display in a professional setting. It was the compound emotion that arrives when you have been wrong about something important, and know it with complete certainty, and cannot yet decide what to do with that knowledge. All 6 delegates left with the clear understanding that the contract was still alive. None of them had any doubt about who had saved it. After the room cleared, Evelyn sat alone in the empty conference room for nearly 20 minutes in one of the chairs she usually occupied at the head of the table and thought. She had been building GlobalAxis for nearly 3 years since becoming CEO. She had interviewed hundreds of people and developed very specific opinions about what competence looked like, what ambition looked like, what potential looked like, all organized around a fixed vocabulary of credentials and signals and institutions. And she had walked past Caleb Harper's desk roughly 40 times without once seeing him. That evening, she accessed his personnel file for the first time. It had been transferred from the previous regional operations team when Caleb relocated to Chicago, and it contained the full record of his professional history prior to joining GlobalAxis. She opened it with the slightly detached efficiency of someone expecting to scan and close. She did not scan and close. She read for 45 minutes, the degrees in international business and linguistics, the graduate work in cross-cultural negotiation, the 7 years at the maritime conglomerate, with a final title, 3 levels above his current role, the 2 industry awards, the letters of commendation, including one from a German industrial firm she recognized, which described him in terms she could not imagine applying to the person she had imagined when she heard his name on the operations roster. At the very end of the employment record, one line, voluntary departure. Personal circumstances. She closed the laptop and sat with that phrase for a long time. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, she drove to the northwest side and rang the buzzer of a second-floor apartment. Grace answered the intercom, and when Caleb came to the door, his expression was the same measured, unreadable look Evelyn had been seeing all week. Not cold, but not open either, the face of someone who has learned to wait before deciding what a situation means. She told him she wanted to talk. He invited her in. The apartment was small and real, with children's drawings on the wall and library books on the kitchen counter, and Grace's language flashcards spread across the coffee table like a deck of cards mid-game. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet, was a drawing Grace had made of the 2 of them, labeled at the bottom in 3 languages. Father, Papa, Oto-san. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table while Caleb made coffee. Grace, who had been coloring at the other end of the table, looked at her with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old with no reason to be guarded yet. "Are you the lady from Daddy's work?" Grace asked. Evelyn said yes. Grace thought about this. "Do you still think he doesn't understand stuff?" Evelyn felt the question like something physical. She looked at the drawings on the wall, the flashcards on the coffee table, the stack of books with their annotated margins, and said very honestly, "No, I was wrong about that." Grace seemed to accept this as sufficient and went back to her coloring. Evelyn looked at the apartment, the real, whole, deliberately chosen life inside it, and began, slowly, to understand something about the difference between the life a person builds for others to see and the life a person builds because it is the one they actually want. The weeks that followed were not a sudden transformation. Evelyn did not arrive at the office on Monday morning with a new philosophy, and a different wardrobe. Genuine change of the durable kind rarely announces itself. What happened instead was quieter and more lasting. A gradual reorientation of attention. A shift in who she noticed and how she listened. A growing awareness of how much of the company's actual operational intelligence was sitting in the heads of people whose names she had never learned. She began stopping at desks on the operations floor on her way to morning meetings, not with the staged cheerfulness of an executive on a morale tour, but with the specific and slightly awkward sincerity of someone genuinely trying to learn something they should have known earlier. She discovered that the overnight logistics team had developed 3 informal workarounds for system inefficiencies the engineering department had been trying to solve for 8 months. She discovered that the woman who managed outbound document coordination had a background in supply chain law and had been quietly flagging compliance risks in shipping contracts for 2 years without anyone acting on her reports. She discovered, again and again, that the information she needed had always been present in the organization. It had simply been invisible to her, because she had not been looking in the right direction. With Caleb specifically, the relationship changed in the way relationships change when both people involved are honest and neither is performing. They began talking about the AI system's architecture, about the implementation framework, about the cultural dynamics of each partner region. And Evelyn found that talking to Caleb was unlike talking to most of her executive team, not because he said what she wanted to hear, but because he said what he actually thought, in plain language, without wrapping it in the careful qualifications of someone managing upward. One afternoon, she brought a set of illustrated language books for children to leave at his desk, one for each of the 6 languages he had spoken in the meeting room, with the particular awkwardness of someone not entirely sure how their gesture will be received. Later that week, during their noon video call, Grace held up each book to the camera and named the language, then looked at the screen and asked, "Is the lady who thought you didn't understand things going to be nice now?" Caleb looked at his phone for a moment before answering. He said, "I think she's working on it." That evening, in her office on the 42nd floor after the building had mostly emptied, Evelyn sat alone with that sentence and found it, somehow, more generous than she deserved. 4 weeks after the summit, while reviewing post-integration compliance reports as part of his new informal role supporting the international contract team, Caleb found something that did not belong. It was a small discrepancy, a timestamp anomaly in the system log from 10 days before the summit, showing that a specific engineering review of the AI translation module had been accessed, flagged internally, and then marked as resolved, with a single notation line, offering no technical explanation. The flag had been raised by one of the junior engineers on the AI team, a young woman who had identified the same translation error Caleb had reported. Her flag had been escalated once. It had reached the desk of Marcus Donovan, the company's chief operating officer, and the executive who had been most publicly enthusiastic about the contract signing timeline. Caleb looked at the surrounding entries. Donovan had accessed the flag, written the resolution notation himself, and routed the original engineer's report into an archived folder, where it would not appear in routine compliance reviews. He then approved the contract timeline to proceed on schedule. Caleb pulled the correspondence files and found 3 emails between Donovan and the company's compensation committee, dated 8 months prior, in which Donovan had lobbied to have a significant stock option package tied specifically to the signing of a large international contract before the end of the fiscal year. The option value, if exercised, was worth approximately $4 million. The math was not complicated. He brought what he had found to Evelyn, not accusations, but timestamps, file paths, email records, and the original engineering flag with the junior engineer's technical analysis, which was identical in its conclusion to his own report from 11 days prior. Evelyn listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, in a tone that contained no performance, "How long have you known?" He said he had suspected for a few days and wanted to be certain before bringing it to her. She nodded and said, "Thank you for bringing it to me directly." She meant it. The board meeting was called for the following Thursday. Evelyn presented the findings herself, not delegated, not summarized through legal, but in her own voice with the full documentation. Donovan attempted to reframe the issue as a procedural oversight, a rushed review, a communication gap, an honest mistake in a high-pressure timeline. It was a reasonable effort, and it might have partially succeeded, except that 3 of the 6 international partner representatives were patched in by video to the latter portion of the meeting, at Evelyn's request, to give a direct account of the summit session. The lead German delegate confirmed that the translation error had nearly ended the partnership. The Japanese lead delegate confirmed that without a skilled and honest intervention, their delegation would have formally withdrawn. When the board asked who had provided that intervention, all 3 delegates said the same name. When the board then asked why that person had not been included in the original summit briefing as a language specialist, nobody in the room had a satisfying answer. Donovan resigned before the end of the day. The junior engineer who had originally flagged the translation error received a formal apology, a retroactive performance bonus, and a promotion to the AI systems review team. Her name was placed prominently in the corrective action report as the first person to identify the problem, as it should have been. In the months that followed, GlobalAxis underwent a quiet but significant reorganization. The International Operations Division was restructured around the principle stated plainly in Evelyn's internal announcement that global business required global fluency, not just in language but in the cultural and operational logic that language carries with it. 3 new positions were created on the International Contract Management Team, with explicit requirements for cultural competency and multilingual capacity, rather than the credential proxies that had governed hiring before. Evelyn also commissioned a full review of the company's internal reporting pathways, specifically to understand how critical technical concerns raised by non-senior employees had been systematically reaching dead ends. The review took 6 weeks and produced a report that was difficult reading for everyone in the leadership tier. Evelyn offered Caleb the role of Global Communications Director, a senior leadership position with the salary and authority that came with it. She made the offer in person, at his desk on the operations floor, which she was now in the habit of visiting, without it being a notable event. Caleb listened to the offer, thanked her, and told her he would not take it. Evelyn, who had prepared herself for this possibility, asked him why. He said that the role she was describing required someone primarily focused on the company, and that he was primarily focused on his daughter, and that he had made that arrangement deliberately and did not wish to undo it. He said he would be glad to take on a flexible advisory role working on international client relations, cross-cultural communication review, and contract language analysis that would allow him to contribute meaningfully, while maintaining the schedule Grace's life was built around. Evelyn agreed without hesitation, and told him the compensation for the advisory role would reflect the value he was bringing, not the title attached to it. He said that was fine. The global summit that closed out the fiscal year was held at a restored lakefront venue with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Lake Michigan, and it had a different quality than the meetings that had preceded it. It felt, people noted afterward, like a room where everyone present actually wanted to be there. Grace came with Caleb that evening because his usual babysitter had a family commitment, and because Grace, when informed she could not come, had argued her case in 3 languages with enough conviction that Caleb had decided the world could accommodate her presence for one evening. She arrived in a dress she had picked out herself, which featured both pockets and what she described as rainbow stripes that are actually flags, and she spent the first hours sitting at a small table near the window with a set of language flashcards she had brought in her backpack, sorting them into piles by country. One of the Japanese delegates found her there and crouched down to look at what she was doing. They exchanged a few words. Grace, it turned out, knew more Japanese than she was usually given credit for. The delegate called his colleague over. Somewhere during the course of the evening, a new hire from the company's domestic operations team, a young man who had joined GlobalAxis 2 months earlier and had not been at the original summit, found himself standing near Caleb at the edge of the room and asked, with the open curiosity of someone still mapping the company's social geography, "So what exactly does he do here?" Evelyn, who happened to be standing close enough to hear, turned from the conversation she was in and looked at Caleb for a moment before answering. She said, "He is the smartest person in this company, and also the most humble." Caleb looked at her briefly. He did not correct her, and he did not agree with her, which was itself a kind of answer. Then his daughter appeared at his elbow, tugging his sleeve and telling him something rapid and bright in Japanese. And he laughed a real laugh, easy and fully inhabited, and replied to her in kind, and then in French, for no reason, and then in Spanish, because it made Grace dissolve into the particular laughter of a child who thinks her father is the funniest person alive. Around them, the room of executives and delegates and partners and new hires was filled with the sound of that laughter, warm and unself-conscious, and entirely beyond the reach of any credential or hierarchy. And for a moment everyone in it was simply present, and the evening was simply good. There is a kind of greatness that never announces itself. It does not come with the right clothes, or the right building, or the right title. It lives in people who have learned what actually matters, and have arranged their lives accordingly, quietly, without apology, and therefore free from the particular exhaustion that comes from performing for the wrong audience. Caleb Harper had known for a long time what he was worth. He had simply stopped waiting for a room to tell him so. And in the end, the room had found out anyway, not because he had shown them, but because the truth has a habit, eventually, of making itself visible.